what we got going on today? Let me pull up a chair and tell you right quick. What we're gonna do today, we're gonna torture test this saw. It didn't pass the torture test before, be 100% honest with you. I'm gonna set that out of the way, talk to you just a minute. That's my Stihl 026. I got the numbers wrote down here on the table. Tell you what it was, tell you what it is, tell you why it failed me. We were running about 165 compression on it. 98 exhaust, roof open, 99 close, 69 intake open, 68 close, 124 transfers open, 123 close, 22,000 squish, 60 D-sack cylinder. Made 4.78 horsepower, give or take, right? Depends on where we was at in there muffler wise, but that's about where it ended up, 4.78 horsepower. Up from, if I remember right, that saw was 2.99 when I put the aftermarket cylinder on it. That's where it run, 2.99 up to 4.78. Boy, that's a heck of a gain, isn't it? And I've said all along, this saw's for my dad. I'm old, and he's my dad, so therefore, numerically speaking, he's got to be older than me, right? He's pushing 80. And he can still start his 361. As long as it was not out in 20-degree weather, left out in the barn all night. As long as it's warm, out of the house or whatever, he can start it. Unless he floods it. If he floods it or something, oh, it wears him out too much just pull and pull and pull. So I wanted him a smaller saw, a lighter saw. But I wanted him to have a lot of horsepower, right? I brought my 026 up there. And we come up with 2, maybe 3 problems. Yeah, he can start my 026, but it's harder to start than his 361. Well, that's a loss right there, because that ain't gonna turn on like that 361, is it? Even up to this, we're still below 361 if we do a muffler mod and stuff like that. So, failure number 1, it's harder to pull over than his 361. Failure. Number 2, we was cutting big wood. It's harder for me to start. We was cutting big wood. We was cutting probably 30-inch wood, 20-inch bar. You know how it is, and you're in there a long time. The way we cut firewood, it's about as hard on them as milling. You're just in the cut forever, and as soon as you're off that cut, you're not walking around letting off throttle, letting it cool down. You're through that cut. It's hitting the ground. You picked her up, and you're already in the next one. Did not like it. Did not like it a bit. Matter of fact, I was doing it myself here, basically just doing a torture test in a wood pile. Run the crank. Now, theoretically, that's part of another problem too. And that other problem was, after it got hotter, it wasn't getting enough fuel. This thing stood a 1-minute heat run just as often as I wanted to do it on the dyno. It stood going out and cutting some cookies. It stood going out and cutting up some 10, 12-inch wood, just working on tree tops and stuff. I went here before I ever brought it up there and went to just torture testing it for a full tank. Just stayed on it, just as big of wood as I could get, because it's got to pass that test, right? It didn't. Put a new crank in it. Put a new cylinder, piston. We were under all. I redid the crank, cylinder, and piston. And brought her up there to him. She'll run now, won't she? Fatten it up just a little bit. And it was running fat, and I'd check it. I'd cut a cut or two, and I'd check it, and it was doing all right. Well, if you run it hard the whole tank, she was getting lean towards the end. It was leaning out. Spun another bearing. Didn't ruin the crank. Did ruin the piston. It broke up the bearing, sent a piece up transfers, ruined the piston, cylinder, and was able to save the crank. So, what did we do? We did a carburetor mod, of course. That's fixed our problem. I'm satisfied. But it didn't fix our problem that he can't start this saw, or it's not easier to start than the 361. So we were at 165. The reason I tell you all that is we're getting ready to put this thing on the dyno, and see how much horsepower we lost by me basically deporting this saw, unporting this saw, whatever you want to call it. Now, we should still be above factory, but how much did we lose off of where I was at maximum with just very minimal machine work? I took just enough off the base set to squish because it was at 40-some thousandths, maybe 50 thousandths to begin with without a base gasket. So, I mean, I did those things. But I didn't get stupid with the machine work. I didn't cut the chamber and boost compression beyond that. I just fixed it, right? Well, that was too much. So we went from 165 to 130 PSI. So we've dropped 35 PSI, and that saw is a dream to pull over. Before, when you was pulling it over, it would pop the decomp as soon as you pulled it over. Now he can, now we could hit decomp and start that saw, and that decomp in there, she just pulls over. So that's going to be way easier than this 361. So what I do to do that? Well, I had a dome piston on that factory, aftermarket factory. So hard for me to illustrate here. We'll consider this the dome of the piston, and then when it comes down to the side, I took the whole dome off plus 25 thousandths off the pistons, what I did. And instead of 22,000 squish, now we got 44,000 squish. We beggared to squish up a bunch. So we're going to put her on dyno. I've already cut a full tank of gas soot just as hard as I can. I was cutting cookies. That way I didn't even move. As soon as I made it through, it was about 20-inch lumber. As soon as I made it through, right back up, right back down through. Done that for a whole tank. And towards the end, it actually run better than it did in the beginning because it was getting hotter and I still had enough fuel to it. So we're doing good. We're going to do the torture test on dyno, I think is what we're going to call it. So we're going to get this saw on the dyno. I've already had it in the wood. I've gave it a torture test there. We're going to give it a torture test on the dyno. And what we're going to do is we're going to check, we're going to do a 3-minute pull on this thing at around 10,000 RPMs. The max it'll pull at 10,000 RPMs. We're going to see how hot we can get it. We're going to see where that compared to where we used to be. We'll compare it to a stock 465 Rancher. It's the only thing I've went to doing that long on. While we're doing that, we're also going to do fuel consumption on it. I expect it's going to be a good bit harder on fuel than, say, that 455 Rancher on horsepower hours per gallon, which is a way we can test one saw off another. So we can do that here on this dyno. Plus, of course, we'll get a regular dyno run. So we'll get us a heat run, a heat saturation run, see how it declines. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not even sure this in here is going to decline with heat saturation. I'm thinking it may actually increase. The way I've got it tuned, we may actually gain horsepower the time we're in the cut. We may not. I just wouldn't be surprised the way I've got it ported. This is what I would call right now, and it may blow up on me, but this is what I would call a genuine firewood cutting saw. You don't ever have to let off the throttle. You don't have to let her breathe. You can just give it meanness, and it seems to like it and seems to take it now. So that's where we're at. The old 026 has evolved a bunch since we started, hadn't it? Hopefully this is the last iteration. If it'll hold through this and here, if he can start it good, and if it'll hold through, I think we can stick a fork in it. It's done. Stick with me. Let's see what the results show. Stihl 026 detuned, running fat. Well, thanks for sticking around this long, everybody. Okay, we got the detuned horsepower. That is the red line. Red line's always the latest iteration. The green line's what it was when we started. The blue line was the last configuration, which we've been higher than this, but that's where the last configuration was at. So, over stock with the detuned, taking that much off cylinder, we're down to 3.99 horsepower, which if you look at that, that's a heck of a decrease over what we were at. But on the other hand, it's a heck of an increase over where we started. That ought to tell you right there, there's really no argument that compression equals horsepower. It's just how are you going to get the compression. This has probably a lower static compression than stock did because we got 44,000 squish, but we still got a lot of gain, don't we? Because we increased the dynamic horsepower by that much. And if you're only going to put a third in a saw, then a third's a big gain. But if you're only going to put a third in a saw, go to your strengths. If you don't have a lathe, then do the porting. Learn the porting good. If you got a lathe and you can do the machine work, you don't have to be near as good at porting. I personally love figuring out the porting and getting my gains on the porting side versus the machining side. I can machine it. I can machine anything. We could have been way over this with machine work, but that wasn't my exercise. That wasn't my mental exercise. Now, there's a big benefit. Now, we lost horsepower. The two blue lines are the previous. The two red lines are the current. And this is our heat run. And this top red line, man, it gets wonky as heck. That's because I am running this saw so fat. I mean, so fat to be abused. And it's been abused, and it handled up good to it. The blue line was the previous one, and I had it more or less tuned on the dyno. And we started out at 3.91 horse, and after 3 minutes, we was down to 3.62. On this one here, we started out at 3.46, and after 3 minutes, we was at 3.51. The hotter this saw gets, the better it runs, the way I've particularly got it tuned. But look how much heat we lost by getting rid of compression, whether it be static or dynamic. We started out, they were a little different starting out. One started out 251 degrees and made it to 391. That's 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a pretty big gain, right? And you can see it gained a bunch right here. It was climbing pretty fast up to, say, 350 degrees, right? Well, this second, when it was detuned, we started out 9 degrees cooler, right? But we wound up 58 degrees cooler. I mean, we never gained near as much heat in that saw. This saw is staying cool. It's going to live life. It's going to be happy. Now here, right here, stick around for just a second. Right here, I want to show you something that just flabbergasted me as fat as I'm running this saw, which was my fuel consumption chart, right? We don't have too much on it, but we had the OX torque on there. That was our first baseline. But we got the Stihl 26, the 5th cylinder, which was the other one, and we got the detuned cylinder. So we've got those two to compare apples to apples, right? The more powerful cylinder was using 0.65 gallons per hour or 2.46 liters per hour, and the detuned one was using 0.41 gallons per hour or 1.5 gallons per hour, which you'd expect that more horsepower takes more fuel, right? But to judge fuel economy, we need to go to horsepower hours per gallon or horsepower hours per liter. Well, we actually gained fuel economy on the detuned cylinder. We went from 5.18 horsepower hours per gallon to 8.1 horsepower hours per gallon. So what that tells you is in detuned, I would get 8.1 horsepower out of that saw running it for 1 hour on 1 gallon of fuel. The same gallon of fuel in the same hour would only give us 5.18 horsepower. That's all the horsepower we could extract out of that by stretching that fuel out over an hour. Same thing with liters. So guys, wrap your head around that. Tell me what you think. I really like how the saw runs right now, and I like it that now my dad can start it. He's pushing 80. So, yeah, we're not trying to win the races out of it. We're trying to make a saw he can use. And actually, this saw did need some machine work, but not to boost the compression, but to take some of it away. Everything we've gained here was through porting knowledge, and boy, that makes me feel good.